Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you join us. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies here at the university, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this session today. Before we start off, let me acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Masonish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. This land acknowledgement and the legacy of the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples speaks directly to the nature of the theme of our session today, the dispossession of land, of property, of livelihood. And so I'm really pleased to welcome you to this session, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Laura Brace here from the University of Leicester, who will present on slavery and dispossession. However, at this point, I would like to hand it over the moderation of the session to Andrew Buck, who is an associate fellow at the Center for Global Studies and an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Law. Prior to coming to Victoria, Andrew was a professor in the Faculty of Law at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, where he taught legal history and property law. And he has taken over and helps us with the property rights in society group and research group that we have going at the Center for Global Studies. So, Andrew, over to you. Thank you very much for hosting this and for having put us in contact with Laura. And very much look forward to this session. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Well, it's an amazing pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today. Laura Brace, I have to confess, Laura and I have known each other since a previous century. And Laura has published and worked together. Laura is one of the foremost political theorists who takes a historical bent on understanding property, the concept of property mainly in early modern England, and has done fabulous work. She, one of her early books which was one of my favorite books many years ago, was The Idea of Property in 17th century England. Fabulous book. She followed that up with another book looking at the politics of property from the early modern period through to the 19th century. And she's followed that up most recently with her book, The Politics of Slavery. And it's on slavery that she'll be talking to us today. One of the purpose of these whole series of talks is to focus on aspects of dispossession in relation to the concept of property. And dispossession takes many forms. And so it's great that Laura is here to be able to talk to us in one of those dimensions, which is the relationship between slavery, property, and dispossession. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Laura. Laura.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much to all of you for hosting me. This is really exciting, and I'm very pleased to be with you virtually in Victoria. Yes, as Andrew says, we've known each other for a long time, and I've been working on these questions for a long time. And one of the places that we met was at the London Freedom Conference that Andrew organised right back, as we were saying, in 1999. And when I was working there, I was particularly working on discourses around improvement. And I've really found that keep coming back to that as a theme. And I was writing this paper as well, improvement came back as a kind of key question and issue. So that's been really interesting to find that. So what I wanted to do, Andrew was saying this was about dispossession. And that sparked a lot of different sort of strands of thought. But what I wanted to do was focus on the arguments of the West Indian planters and the slave owners, and their howls against their dispossession around the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, but also before that in the pamphlet debates in the 1790s, when they were talking about their right to property and their slaves was coming under attack, obviously, from anti-slavery writers and campaigners. And I wanted to talk about how they tried to shore up their ownership and mount a defence against their own dispossession. So in his speech to the House of Lords on the second reading of the bill for the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, Sir Thomas Plumer spoke in support of the West Indian planters. And in doing that, he stressed the legality of the slave trade, its foundations in the Royal Africa Company in the 17th century, and John Locke's involvement. What, my lords, he asked, are we to be told that these men did not understand plain principles of humanity and justice? And I thought that's a really interesting question. And I wanted to look at how the planters tried to present themselves in the debates as adhering to principles of humanity and justice, and how they understood themselves to be following those principles, and what his speech tells us about dispossession, where the planters and their supporters, what it was they felt was being taken away from them, and what the nature was of their property that they felt that they stood to lose from abolition. So Plumer saw himself as defending the private property that belonged to who he called the unoffending subjects of this country. He was appealing to have the principles of justice and humanity extended to the West India planters and merchants as subjects of the British Empire and as actors who were not the authors of this trade, but who had been led into it by the illustrious ancestors of the current incumbents of the House of Lords, who he's talking to in 1807. He valued their property in human beings at between 90 and 100 million pounds, and argued that the West India commerce paid annual duties of between of upwards of 3 million pounds, so that they were contributing 1/3 of exports and 1/3 of imports to Great Britain, to the economy. All this income and wealth, he said, had been sanctioned by Parliament for 150 years. And these unoffending subjects had entered into all kinds of settlements, made provision for their families, provided securities for creditors, and now maintained thousands and tens of thousands of British subjects. Their capital underpinned the stability of the British economy, as well as the improvement of their plantations in the West Indies. Their property in the Caribbean, the way he presents that is as a work in progress. The planters had patents from the Crown and grants for settling, clearing and cultivating the country. They had paid out money and expense upon the faith of Parliament, who had declared the wisdom and propriety of this trade and invited foreigners and these British subjects to what he called embark their capital in it. So they've been underpinned by the state. So he was pointing that out, the ways in which the planters relied on the state. And also he wanted to talk about some of the ways in which plantation wealth was embedded in the global economy, and at the same time threaded through the stability of landed property in Britain, so the colonies coming home, in ways because it underpinned things like aristocratic marriages, their inheritance strategies, and their estates. So he was reiterating the history of the slave trade and stressing its longevity, its roots back into the 17th century. But he was also pointing out its modernity and its role in sustaining the capitalist imperialist state. As Holly Brewer has argued in her discussion of slavery and sovereignty in Locke, freedom for whites rested on this ability to have free trade in slaves. And in that sense, she says, slavery created modernity. Plumer, I think, is expressing concern that this delicately balanced ecosystem, this modern global system, would fall apart on abolition, that private property itself would fall into decay, and the plantations would revert to being concentrated in the hands of the few. And those few aristocratic owners would then fail to renovate them or to cultivate the land profitably. So in his view, the dispossession is that the anti-slavery cause is risking dispossessing Britain of her modernity. The security of the islands, Plumer went on, depended on the continuance and increase of the white population, and in particular on the people called the yeomanry, or the small settlers, who constitute the defensive force of the colonies. The safety of the island was in their hands, and it was their property that was under threat. It's quite interesting, Plumer, and I think it's significant that he sets up a distinction between these smallholders, these small settlers, and the people that he called the most opulent persons who possess estates, who didn't, and then he goes on to say, but do not themselves reside upon the spot. So even these more conservative thinkers who want to defend the interests of the planters have got it in for the absentee landowners. Trevor Bernard has estimated the likely number of absentee proprietors in the late 18th century at between 150 and 155. So that's between 3 and 6% of the white population. But they've got a lot of land concentrated in their hands. So it's not very many of them, but a lot of them had estates that were over 2,500 acres. So they end up owning or holding nearly a quarter of the land, 24.4% of the land. For the defenders of slavery, even, these absentee proprietors represented a problem, and they epitomised a problematic opulence and a focus on profit that undermined the attempts to present the slaveholders as unoffending subjects. As Bernard argues, absentee slave owners were demonised as socially harmful, as hampering development, as leeching money out of the colony and fostering slave rebellion. And Plumer sort of buys into that picture of them. Their absenteeism signalled a lack of commitment to the colonies and an indifference to improvement. So not just for the abolitionists making those criticisms, but the conservatives as well. And I think West Indian planters struggled to give their property the permanence and the cachet that was attached to revenues that derived from landed estates in Europe. They had their hold on their landed property was not enough to ground them as settled English people, because the West Indies were in themselves figured as morally suspect, a disturbing place full of death and violence and hybridity. The absentee proprietors of large estates were stigmatised, I think, for being too aristocratic and for not being aristocratic enough. So they have a particular approach to property ownership that looks like it reflects more feudal principles of hereditary hierarchy, of absolutist rule. They look like oligarchs, and they look like they're hoarding as well, hoarding the spoils rather than improving the land. So these planters were seen as having been affected by trying to live in the West Indies. So they'd been affected by the heat. They were described as being licentious and slothful and addicted to vice and to luxury. They weren't really invited into that space of gentlemanly conversation that says that you can pursue self-interest as long as you're acting in the common good. They weren't seen as doing that. They were seen much more as in it for the profit. And that was dangerous for them in how they were perceived, because their treasured property and whiteness was being called into question as their possession and occupation of the land was stigmatized. As Cheryl Harris argues, it was crucial to have the property of being white, and settlement and possession had embedded the fact of white privilege into the very definition of property. Abolition for the proprietors risked loosening their grip on whiteness by making their property rights unenforceable and by undermining their reasonable expectations of owning that property and being able to pass it on, and also in disconnecting them from the state. The way in which the state had underpinned their property was very important. At the same time, their absence from their estates made their own land ownership insubstantial. They were seen as being ready to risk their property in ways that made them suspect. James Adair is interesting on this. He argued that many proprietors came to Jamaica to waste their fortunes and left their estates to interested, unprincipled men on such low salaries that they were bound to embezzle and steal from their employers. Ruin must be the consequence, and hence it is that their estates sometimes fall into the hands of strangers, even tailors and hucksters. And I think this sense of letting their estates fall and be compromised was also reflected in their approach, seen as being reflected in their approach to inheritance. So obviously these absentee proprietors, you've only got a small number of elite white West Indian men who had access to upper class white wives as what Green calls genealogical capital. But you had many other planters and their surrogates who only had access to black women, making it harder for them to keep their property within the extended family and also to ensure its whiteness. Absentee proprietors were tied to the colonies, but not of them, is how Nick Draper puts it, so that they were seen as members of British society, but as West Indian at the same time. So their ownership did nothing to guarantee peace and permanence. And in effect, through their absenteeism, they kind of dispossessed themselves and at the same time brought their whiteness into disrepute. So the dispossession of these absentee landlords was one thing, but Plumer was arguing that the real existential threat to the colonies lay in undermining the small settlers' reason to be there. Abolition risked their almost total emigration because the government was about to remove all the motives which excite them to encounter the insalubrious climate and all the inducements which tempt them to continue there. This group of people, overseers and little settlers and other white inhabitants, were not there for their salaries, but for the opportunity. And that opportunity, Plumer describes, is the opportunity of purchasing first a single Negro, then a second, then a third, as their funds increase. What was being lost through dispossession, Plumer is saying, was this kind of entrepreneurial spirit, I guess, these small investors who were prepared to take things slowly, to be on the spot and build up their own experience and local knowledge. Thus they begin, said Plumer, and by degrees form coffee plantations. And unlike the sugar barons, these stalwart men rendered the country more salubrious and improved the land. And that's partly because coffee plantations tended to be smaller. They worked more with the climate because they could use the heavy rainfall, so they didn't need irrigation in the same way. So coffee generally was much less demanding as a crop than sugar and required less capital and a smaller workforce. Abolition, Plumer is saying, risked making these smaller, more improving settlers sell up, desert their half-cultivated estates, their work in progress, and sell their slaves. And when they do that, they're going to sell them on to the more opulent planters. They're going to leave the islands without a yeomanry and without the main strength by which the islands must be protected. And so Plumer wanted to defend the private property of the colonies that rested on what he called the broad basis of experience and local knowledge. So he has this narrative of dispossession, or against dispossession, that rested on a defence of property, this idea that it's grown up over a century and a half, that it's making provisions for families, for widows, for children, for mortgages, and that it all rests on these notions of trust and covenant. In breaking their covenant, the lords were pulling down a whole system and burying it in ruins. They were, Plumer charged, listening to the voice of humanity from Africa without attending to the miseries you will at the same time inflict upon British subjects. In the 1807 debates over the abolition of the slave trade, this phrase, justice, humanity, and sound policy, became a kind of anti-slavery mantra. And the planters wanted to counter that. And they argued that the abolitionists were focusing on relieving the distant suffering of others, rather than tackling the more immediate poverty confronting them at home. So Plumer was contrasting this concern for distant others with the imperative of protecting the British imperial state, reminding the members of the government where their primary duties lay and whose property really counted in underpinning stability and sovereignty. Back in 1792, you got a very similar defence of the West Indian commercial interest. William Innes painted a picture of the planter as an industrious investor with a legitimate stake in slavery as a system of commerce endorsed by the state. And he wasn't so much condemning their absenteeism and opulence as defending or arguing for a transnational identity for West Indians. He says the West Indian planters, merchants and sailors were the citizens of both Britain and the islands, which are a summer house to England, since so great a number of its inhabitants are in the habit of going and coming between them. The planters were, in his view, as warm friends as any of the British Empire to the highest degree of liberty, consistent with order and good government, and the widest range of humanity. Humanity not to Africans only, but also to Europeans. And I think it's this term humanity is one that's really interesting to try to understand. In the late 18th century, in order to understand the dispossession of the planters, we need to understand how property was underwritten and authored by slavery. For the West India interest, defending slavery and the slave trade was about defending property and freedom, the highest degree of liberty and the widest range of humanity. They shared a definition of humanity as the relief of distress, but they made what Peter Singer identified much later as the argument from proximity, to argue that a duty to humanity that ranges over the whole of mankind was too demanding. Instead, they tried to find a way of arbitrarily truncating the principle so as to arrive at a convenient answer. They challenged the moral legitimacy of what they called the abolitionists' specious pretense of tender anxiety in the cause of humanity, and argued that there was no need to seek abroad for it, for humanity, as long as we can use our own humanity with propriety amongst ourselves. The proper use of our humanity, they argued, was to express a tender regard for our fellow creatures by helping the sick and infirm, the poor and the aged. Their suffering, they said, had been disregarded by all sorts of people who have been incited to interest themselves in the visionary distresses of the Negroes in Africa, instead of focusing on the swarms of beggars, vagrants, thieves, and real objects of charity on their own streets. This is what Simon Caney identifies as an associational approach to humanity and justice, one that focuses on questions of belonging and membership, the special rights, obligations, and entitlements that we have in the context of our state, so our own humanity, and spreading it amongst ourselves. And I think this is another layer of dispossession that they feared through abolition, losing the battle over the meanings of humanity, justice, and sound policy, as they came to be defined in more universal cosmopolitan terms. In that sense, the planters and the West India interest were doing battle with what Caney calls the humanity-centred cosmopolitan egalitarians on the abolitionist side of the argument. And they wanted, obviously, a more universal definition of humanity and to extend the scope of justice to include the Africans. It was, William Fox argued, European pride that suggested to us that the rights of men were limited to any nation or to any colour. Are then the offices of humanity and the functions of justice to be circumscribed by geographical boundaries, he asked. The planters' understanding of humanity was rooted in their conception of property, and property for them was about stability and safety and respect for tradition and government. In facing the abolition of the slave trade, conservative thinkers were prepared for reforms that were undertaken out of necessity. I think they knew really what was coming. And they thought they could try to limit abolition so that it conserved the rights and liberties of the existing political order. They were trying to guard the essence of property, its inheritability and its whiteness, from the incursions of radical democratic and cosmopolitan thinking, and from the kind of the abolition of the slave trade implied. At the same time, they're guarding their own Englishness, and that Englishness was coming to be identified with liberty and humanity. So they talk about humanity as the first and noblest characteristic of English men, and make a kind of direct pitch for the West Indians to be recognised as true Englishmen, as English identity becomes inextricable from being a friend to liberty and humanity. So they're arguing that the West Indian planters possess these sentiments so that they can be brought into being seen as civilized, part of a civilized British nation, valuing liberty above all else. And so this was a humanity that they found to be compatible with owning a property in another person. The property, obviously, part of their property was in their slaves, but they presented their slave ownership as a form of property that could help to guarantee security and improvement. So in contrast to this sort of rage that they talk about in the absentee sugar barons, who pushed the slaves beyond their strength and treated them as objects of circulation and exchange, and clearly should be stigmatized for that. They contrast that with the other slave owners who were husbanding their slaves and offering them security and protection. They talk a lot about how slaves in the West Indies enjoyed the protection of a master and the security of knowing they would be given enough food each day and cared for in sickness and old age. And that's where they contrast it to being a day labourer or a peasant in England, where you have to support yourself in sickness, you have to rent your own home, you have to buy your own clothes, and you lose pay if you cannot work. And as Jessie Foote puts it, you will be punished if you break the law and steal a turnip. So in this account of their own humanity, the planters saw themselves as insulating the slaves from the vagaries of the market and the precariousness of self-ownership. So for them, their treatment of the slaves reflected their rational and improving approach to ownership. And they almost want to say that depriving them of their property in men would be unjust and damaging to the fabric of society. Their stewardship of their slaves, like the cultivation of their estates, was a work in progress, holding back insurrection. So in the same way as some planters improved their land, they also improved their slaves. They kind of held them in check and stewarded their property in their person for them, helping them towards civilization, getting them ready for freedom and helping them to be fit members of civil society. And that's how they figure themselves as these humanitarian figures who are fulfilling their special moral responsibilities towards their slaves. I was looking at James Ramsey's pamphlet, and he's an abolitionist, but he's very interesting, and he talks about being very worried. He was a plantation owner who became an abolitionist, and he talks about being worried about his slaves who were freed too abruptly. He managed somehow to make it sound like being freed was a kind of dispossession for the slaves. Someone who'd been enslaved for a long time, he argued, needed fixed employment and to be a part of a family in order to demean himself properly and be happy in his new state. His account suggests that he needed to moderate his own humanitarian impulses in order to guard the long-term interests of his slaves. He gave the example of one woman whom I hastily freed, though otherwise sensible, having no check on her conduct, has, I am told, turned out worthless and abandoned. This idea of things left unimproved being abandoned and worthless seems to me to be at the heart of the dispossession that the planters feared. If they were no longer there to enclose and husband the slaves, the result would be chaos and ruin. I wish improvement and privilege to go hand in hand, Ramsey concluded. So the abolitionists, of course, contested this vision of humanity, worked to connect humanity to justice. They stressed the duties that followed from the law of nature and from what Diderot called the general will of humanity that was derived from our fundamental sense of injustice. Cuguano made clear that the actions of the slave traders were inimical to justice, equity, reason, and humanity. The abolitionist project, as Fox and Payne defined it, was to combine justice with humanity, where humanity is a question of doing good and justice is a question of power. But to counter that, a lot of the planters and their defenders had this view of gradual emancipation, where slavery would wear away gradually to be replaced with indentured servitude, who would labour the ground and reduce the need to import slaves from Africa. So they have this gradualist approach, which is designed to protect the property rights of the planter, to ensure that he wouldn't suffer any violent loss or disaster. Because again, he has, as Innes puts it, on the system of slavery and the faith of repeated laws, embarked his capital, his industry, his hopes in this world. And that's what they were thinking was going to be taken away from them through abolition. So they argue for a gentle and progressive alteration, for a kind of slow and gradual process through limited slavery towards emancipation. So this approach was a way to limit the dispossession of the planters, to allow them to continue to determine the scope of humanity, to decide where to draw the line. They argued for gradual abolition predicated on making the slaves good members of civil society who knew how to improve themselves and avoid becoming worthless and abandoned. The route to immediate abolition, on the other hand, was based on this humanity-centred cosmopolitan egalitarianism that would risk everything. The abolitionists, the planters insisted, were pursuing a course of conduct calculated to rouse the slaves to an insurrection and act all over again the horrors of San Domingo, Haiti. A general sympathy with the enslaved Africans and indignation at their wrongs cannot but feed the secret sparks of latent discontent and revenge and threaten some sudden eruption, as Innes put it. The experience of the French colonies after the Revolution showed the dangers of the frail vessel of unqualified democracy, ready to be agitated, tossed, and overset by every popular gale. Principles of humanity and justice, the planters were saying, if you try to apply them to the whole of mankind, would destabilise property, not just in slaves, but much more fundamentally. The planters could see the radical egalitarianism behind some of the calls for abolition. And by teaching people, they said, that their natural rights were equal, they would come to expect an equal right in the possession of the good of fortune. From there, they would question their obligation to labour for the support of the rich and dispute whether the rich had a superior natural right to their wealth. The defenders of the slave proprietors could see through the layers of dispossession to the radical consequences of a humanity-centred cosmopolitan egalitarianism. And I think that was not realised by the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 or by the abolition of slavery in 1833. And there are lots of reasons why that didn't come about. But I think some of them are just some of the reasons that it didn't. You can see that it was an abolition process that ends up compensating slave owners in 1833. Thank you. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was fascinating. I mean, the ability of people to be able to turn everything on its head so that the slave owners feel to be dispossessed. Could I ask if people have got questions, could you turn on your video to indicate to me, and that way I'll be able to go from questioner to questioner. Or should I perhaps start it off? Here's my question. The concept of improvement that's absolutely central to your argument. And I was thinking about this particularly when you were talking about the difference between the French colonies and the English colonies. Do you think that there's something essentially English about the historical importance of the concept of improvement? It's something that goes beyond sort of the English becoming modern, that it's a feature of all sort of colonial experiments, or is it overwhelmingly English?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one to which I don't really know the answer because I tend to focus on English sources. So, but it is fascinating to me in how many different contexts you find that improvement discourse bubbling up if you do focus on a kind of English context, definitely. But I don't know because I don't know other sources well enough, but it's a really interesting question.
Okay, thanks. Nick.
Laura, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I learned so much. And I have two questions, and I'm sure you've answered this in some of your more recent work, but so forgive me if that's the case. My first question is just to loop improvement, agrarian improvement, and sort of late enclosure in this period with what we're seeing in this discourse here, because of course that connection is a fascinating one that I'd love to learn more about it. And the second is the very category of dispossession. So are the abolitionists actually arguing that this is a dispossession? Clearly it's a sort of dispossession in a positive sense, in that formally speaking there is title to, the slave planters have a property in a human body, but a human person. But do they recognize that as dispossession, and does this then color the decision ultimately to compensate slave owners subsequently?
Yes, thank you, Nick. Those are great questions. Yes, so that link between I suppose what I found fascinating about that link between agrarian improvement and later enclosure is, I guess, that generally we think about a division, don't we, where slaves are dispossessed of their labour, and Native Americans and others are dispossessed of their land. And I suppose my argument would always be that actually those two are really deeply connected to each other, that both of those dispossessions kind of work together. And you can kind of see in the arguments, when you get really down into these arguments about improvement, a lot of the arguments around slavery are about how the slaves used their own, not their own land, but their provisioning grounds, and whether how they do improvement themselves in some ways, or how they manage to grow enough food to take to the market and to make them, to sort of create their own worlds of exchange and of growing things and having their own plots, was a really important part of what they're arguing about in the abolitionist debates as well. So yeah, I think they're just really deeply connected to each other, and it's hard to pull out those different strands. But actually, it's really important what people do, that question of what people do with their property and whether they improve it or make it productive seems to cross all of those contexts. If that makes sense. And yeah, I didn't have time to do that. The abolitionist approaches to whether this is dispossession are really fascinating, I think. And a lot of the anti-slavery arguments focus on the idea of owning a property in your person, and on what they called man stealing. So very much this kind of idea that the actual injustice was at the moment when people had that property in their person taken from them. So they did see, in that sense, that the planters had dispossessed the slaves because they had stolen their property in their person from them. So then I guess they did see that they were putting that injustice right through a process of abolishing the slave trade and saying you cannot buy and sell people in this way. So yes, but I do think that idea that it's the property in the person that matters means that you end up logically at compensation, because it's still a way of saying what's valuable about people is a property. Whoever owns that, whether it's them or someone else, it's still got that commodification at its core, I guess.
Let me call upon Christopher Curtis, who you may recall from the Land and Freedom Conference in 1990. Chris.
Centuries ago, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, truly fascinating. And again, to echo this positioning of improvement into the debate, I think is really important, and we'll love to read more as you develop this. But I want to push a little bit, and like Andrew and Nick, I think my question concerns the specificity of the English context in which this debate is taking place. And while the defense of these property rights is long-standing, back 150 years, it's not exactly time immemorial. And I'm thinking particularly about the ambivalence of slavery in the English common law, and would like to hear a little bit more about where was that in the debate. And I acknowledge that perhaps this was part of the abolitionist argument response to the pro-slavery argument, but trying to think of particularly, we're making an argument for property rights that seems to be outside of the traditional, the orthodox conception of the common law at the period.
Yeah. Yes, I haven't had a chance to work on this in enough detail to have a really clear response to that. But yeah, I think Holly Brewer has done her work on slavery and sovereignty, I think, in looking at Locke and looking at those questions about how slavery was related to the crown and to the monarchy and actually to the big aristocratic estates being put together there, I think is really interesting. And part of her argument there, isn't it, is that it's just comes about through bits and pieces of the law kind of being put together almost piecemeal from different ways that they're using head rights and different ways that they're coming in to sort of colonize, but also then making up their own rules as they go along in the colonies in that way. So I think that's a really useful way of understanding how they get there, rather than necessarily trying to think of it as kind of like you say, like time immemorial or long past bits of common law. And I think that's interesting, the way that Plumer is definitely saying 150 years ago, and looking back to Locke as well, very clearly wanting to say, this, you can see this going back, and it comes from the Royal Africa Company. And that, rather than rooting it in law, I guess, is rooting it in commerce as well, and saying this is about, it's interesting reading it. It all feels very sort of kind of Brexity, and bits about kind of how you unpick things that have been there for a certain amount of time. So yeah, I think it is looking back and saying you can see an origin to this, but that's in things that were promises that were made. And in a commercial interest in lots of ways, rather than necessarily a legal status, I would say.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps I could call upon Natalie.
Hi, Laura.
Natalie.
Hi. Laura, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know whether this is a helpful analogy that I'd like to introduce and actually ask you to reflect upon or not, but it's certainly the one that sprang to my mind. The different registers of the planters' resistance to abolition, I think, were fascinating, and I think you drew them out in great detail and with a lot of subtlety. But it immediately put me in mind of the different registers of resistance in Canada to the idea of recognizing Indigenous land rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to jump to another topic entirely, but there really did seem to be striking commonalities. I think particularly the way that you drew out the way in which those resisting abolition tried to take a kind of moral tone, where they said, think about the suffering of those close to home. Think about the suffering that you'll inflict on those who have depended upon this system. And even it seems as if they allowed the possibility that it was an unjust system in some sense, but that it was so entrenched that the suffering that would be inflicted upon the widows, the hardworking smallholders, would be so dramatic that it would undermine, the entire system of empire and capitalism. But the first register of, think about the suffering close to home, not the suffering of the others. And always it seems to be the focus was on Africa rather than the others in the West Indies, the others who were actually the slaves.
Yeah.
But then when it almost sounded as if over time, and I'm not sure if I got the time element wrong here, but as if eventually the kind of fallback position was, well, if abolition is inevitable, then let's at least make it gradual. And then the argument, again, being this kind of moral argument that you suggested, particularly in the one pamphlet by the person who was an abolitionist, but had also been a plantation owner, that those exploited are in some sense actually beneficiaries, or at least, if not beneficiaries of slavery, then at least beneficiaries of a gradual dismantling of slavery, that they would have material benefits from a gradual approach. And that strikes me as being amazingly similar to the arguments that have been made for, I don't know if you know much about British Columbia itself, but I mean, the different approaches to trying to understand recognition of land and other kinds of rights of Indigenous peoples here. The idea that, it would be too terribly disruptive, all of the economy would fall apart, all of these poor people who've relied upon the I forget what the phrase was that you quoted, but something like the word of Parliament or the trust of Parliament, that would fall apart. But then if it has to happen, then at least let's make it slow. Very, very striking similarity. And it's actually incredible to me, the commonality of language and tone. I don't know whether you have any comments on that.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, definitely. I think it recalls so many different things, doesn't it? But yes, I think that is a very clear, and I think that idea, like you're talking about the different registers of it, is a really useful way of understanding what they're trying to say. And yes, definitely, it's something about saying we're all so knitted in and everything is so embedded that we couldn't possibly pull one strand, because then everything would would fall apart, and you don't want that to happen. So there's something about it that we need to preserve. Otherwise, chaos and ruin are what's awaiting for us. And definitely that sense of that that there's a material benefit to taking that much more slow and gradual approach. Obviously, they had the example of what had happened in San Domingo and in Haiti to hold up to people to say, well, you don't want this bloodbath, and the French Revolution as well, to say, you can't have this happening. So yeah, I think that's another important element, isn't it, to have something that don't let go of nurse, because something much worse will happen. There's a lot of that kind of argument, I think. What was really interesting, one of the things that I was thinking of when Andrew said about having a theme of dispossession, was that moment of abolition of slavery in 1833, where they compensate the slave owners at that point. And there's been some fantastic, really amazing historical work done on that through the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at UCL. And because it gave them just to go back and look at those records, they could see everyone who had owned slaves in Britain in 1833 because they were compensated. And what they found was they've done a map so that you can look at each person who was given given their compensation. I can't remember how much they paid out. We paid out like £20 million of compensation to 46,000 slave owners in 1833. And when they went and found them, it's not, some of it's obviously aristocrats and great estates, but actually it's people living in fairly ordinary, vicarages, manor houses. It's widows, it's women, it's all kinds of people across the whole country. So I think there was something in their argument that it was all really knitted into the whole system as well. So it is really interesting, I think. But thank you. It's a great question.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions, perhaps? Because I've got a bunch, but I don't want to stand in the way of other people. But I'll launch in with one. Inheritance and the role inheritance played in the transfer of property. And I was wondering if you could tell us something about how that played out when, as you said, a number of the slave owners in the West Indies had white wives and a number didn't. And for the number that didn't, what was the legal status of both the wife and, more to the point, of the child? And how did that configure into the questions of that the abolitionists, or not the abolitionists, the opponents of abolition have got to maintaining a stable structure of society? Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. That one of the things that they want to say, I think, some of the things that they're worried about are that the absentee proprietors are leaving allowing their estates to be run by these licentious and slothful men in the heat of the Caribbean, who are then not acting morally in that situation. So I think part of what they're worried about is the stability of property under those circumstances, that they're allowing their property to be kind of dissipated in various ways. And I think that's one of the questions about their humanity and their status as persons was about that being called into question by them living these sort of dissipated lives in the Caribbean, in that kind of colonial context. I think they were very concerned about that it was all going to become chaotic through that approach, and they much preferred these smallholders who although they might have had a concubine, as they would have called it, they weren't seen as being as dissipated as either the absentee proprietors themselves or the people that the absentee proprietors let be in charge. So again, I think some of that stability came down to the idea that these are men who can kind of manage to husband themselves, I suppose, to keep themselves within some bounds and to understand that they need to be these stalwart men who can protect the country. And it's a different version of masculinity, I think, that they hope that those kind of proprietors can bring into the colonies.
Right, thanks. Rod.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'd like to suggest that it's worth thinking further about these, about the argument, these two different registers, thinking further about whether it's right to dismiss too readily the concerns about continuity and inertia and the question of takings within a system which has been established, built up for a very long time. And we make progress when we see the injustice of the established system. But there is, isn't there, a substantial disruption associated with a system of expectations and property structures that have been built up over decades or centuries. So it's not quite clear how one would go about trying to undo that structure without some thought about the problem of takings. And I don't want to defend the U.S. notion around property and takings, but I was thinking about the current controversy. We've come to think that maybe the intellectual property in vaccines is presenting a really substantial injustice in the global distribution of vaccines, but it is established intellectual property. What do we do about the social consequences of this big disruption?
Yeah. Yes, and I think that was what turns out to be quite interesting, isn't it? That in lots of ways, the abolition that happened, particularly the abolition of the slave trade, where you don't have not accompanied by an abolition of slavery, was actually a lot less radically humanity-centered global egalitarianism than is suggested by some of the abolitionist rhetoric that's coming out in response to some of these planters' worries. And I think a lot of that was to do with that actually a lot of the abolitionists as well wanted to keep a hold of property. They didn't want it to fall into decay and to be destroyed. So they'd come to see, I guess, they'd seen the injustice, but they'd also understood that, in particular, that forced labour might still be required. So a lot of their arguments still allow for the possibility of forced labour, but just not of slavery, chattel slavery in that particular form. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that there is, you can see in their arguments how you get that continuity as well. There's some things that they would agree with the planters about wanting to hold on to, I think.
Do we have any more questions? I'm cognizant of the fact that, oh, Natalie's back. Natalie.
I just have one quick question, and this is, it's another one of those kind of prospective questions. I was struck by the resonance between the language that you quoted to describe the need for this gradual training up of enslaved peoples into the capacities and skills to engage in self-ownership. This sort of language of, training and husbanding their skills and so on from this gradualist approach. And the the language that was used by I'm terribly sorry, I've forgotten the name of it, but under the League of Nations system, mandate territories, it's the mandate system under the League of Nations that then became almost unchanged in the same building and with many of the same personnel, the Trusteeship Council under the United Nations system. The justification for maintaining those territories of formerly colonized peoples, formally, under UN, first League of Nations and then UN, protectorates effectively, which really just continued the colonial arrangements in most cases, but with the argument that it was allowing the training up of populations into the capacities and the institutional structures that would allow them to function as democracies. Again, I don't know if you've thought about making that connection in your work, but it's the same language. It's the very same language. Anthony Angie has written wonderful things illuminating that. Yeah, ANGHIE he's done great work on this, and then many other people inspired by him have pursued that connection. So anyway, I don't know if you have any comment on that, but it did strike me as being something that could be useful.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. I think it's fascinating, that idea of, they had a really clear idea about the fitness for freedom, really, is what they were arguing about. And I mean, even Wilberforce has it, that it's too soon, that they won't be ready, that they don't know, they won't have the capacities to grasp their freedom and to use their own property in their person, I think, and to improve themselves. Really, they can't do it yet. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Thank you.
Well, I'm sort of, given that we don't seem to have any more questions at the moment, and I'm cognizant of the fact that you have given up part of your evening already. For us, it's the beginning of the day.
Right.
For you, it's the end of a very long day. So it might be good to wrap up the session now. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation with a really interesting take on how the dispossessors feel that they are the dispossessed, which is, it's just fascinating. And for everybody here, I have to show everybody this. There isn't a home that shouldn't have a copy of The Politics of Slavery by Laura Brace. It's out there, easy to acquire, and there's so much more in it. It's just wonderful. Laura, it's been absolutely wonderful and marvelous that you could join us, and we've had a great time. And if everybody could indicate their thanks too, that would be really great. But thank you very much, and thanks for everybody being here this morning.